Hello, and thanks for joining me. Today, what I would like to do is go through a lecture series that I do as a part of a course that my company offers, describing kind of in great detail how we should be assessing carbon projects. So, if you're going to buy carbon credits, what are all the things that we should be looking for to make sure that the carbon credits are really high quality? I thought I'd start with a quick background on me. My name's Elias Airy. My background is initially in forest science, so I have a master's and PhD in forest science, mostly focused on forest mensuration and remote sensing. I've been in the carbon markets around the nature-based space for the last 6 years, and for the first 2.5 years of that time, I was head scientist at a big carbon broker called Pachama. They no longer exist; they've been bought out by Carbon Direct. And my role there at Pachama was essentially to evaluate the carbon credits that we were brokering and make sure that they were of high quality. And then, more recently, for the past 3 years, I've been working at Renoster. I'm a co-founder and chief science officer here at this company. And what Renoster has done historically is evaluate carbon projects for people. So we do diligence. So this is our bread and butter. But more recently, what we've been doing is developing our own carbon projects. So we've kind of transitioned from evaluation to development. So I figured this is a good time to go through everything that Renoster would look for in evaluating a carbon project and really kind of give you the same kind of training that we would give a new recruit, like a new recruit at Renoster if they were going to start diligencing projects. So that's kind of enough background on me. Some resources available to you if you want to kind of follow along. Renoster puts out the diligence criteria that we use to evaluate projects, and it's kind of a lighter version of this deck. And like I said, we do host a course online through Thinkific where you can actually sign up and get a whole bunch of lectures. You can actually see this as lecture number 9 of the course. So I guess we can dive right on in. What are the big elements that we're going to focus on in evaluating a carbon project? Well, I would say there are 3 big sections that we've tried to break off in our rubric. The first is infrastructure. So that includes people and organizations, the legality, the political environment, governance and budget. This is kind of all the kind of, logistics and infrastructure that go into creating the project. Scientific assessment. So more or less is the project's quality in terms of like how many credits they're predicting are actually being removed. Is that accurate? And then finally, co-benefits. I think the name itself is a little bit of a misnomer because it makes it sound as if this is kind of like voluntary. But a lot of the time, what we need to do is make sure that the money's going to the right place, equity and justice is being done for those on the ground who are actually doing the work. And that there are biodiversity and ecological co-benefits if that's relevant to the project type. Okay, so let's dive in here. I will say this rubric was a little bit more focused on nature-based stuff, but I don't think that should prohibit you from using it for other project types, and I'll certainly go through examples of other project types in here. In terms of people and organizations, what we're going to try to get to the bottom of here is the people creating the project, the people running the project, the landowners. Are they all kind of above board and do they know what they're doing? And the first thing that we're going to ask here is, does the project have proper land tenure? So does the project have legal documentation proving that they own the land? Or are there disputes? And are there legal merits to those disputes? Now, in the United States and in other developed nations, this is really not too much of a problem, right? Like we can't really think of like the EU, Canada, the US having like these big land disputes of over who owns the land. That's usually pretty well settled at this point. But in the developing world, this can be a really big concern for projects. And there's a number of very large projects that have essentially fallen apart because of improperly secured land tenure. So one of the things I want to highlight that makes this very difficult is that when you do get into the developing world, it can be a situation in which there's no right answer. So, in Brazil, for example, we all want to see these types of projects stop deforestation in Brazil or, sponsor green energy and whatnot in Brazil. But land tenure is fiercely difficult to actually figure out. So this is an example on the right of a Brazilian REDD Plus project. That's an avoided deforestation project. is taking place on private land. It has a valid title. But the land was previously claimed by a neighbor, and you can see this by looking at one of 3 different land tenure databases that Brazil maintains. That's right. They don't have one. They have 3, and they all disagree with each other. But fortunately, that dispute has been solved, and so we'd say that this is no longer necessarily an issue for the project. Another issue here potentially is that the land has a mining stake on it. Once again, in Brazil, you can claim a mining stake on land that you don't own. One of the nuances of Brazil in particular is that, like I said, there's 3 different kind of land tenure databases that all conflict with each other. The land has passed from many hands, over the last couple of decades, and it's very difficult to even figure out who should own the land because, what if somebody owned the land up until 1979 and then the Brazil's military junta took it away from them in a really unjust way, and then in the 90s the Brazilian courts reversed that claim, but the original owner still, essentially occupies the site. This is a real world scenario, and it's very messy to try to figure out what's actually going on here. So in this case, land had a previous claim, but that was settled. Land had a mining stake, but that's a non-binding mining stake. And the land was claimed by a local villager, but the villager was unable to provide any proof. So we would consider this to be actually fairly strong land tenure for a REDD+ project in Brazil, because it gets a lot more complicated than this. There will often be competing claims, but you really have to assess what the veracity of those claims are, and even do a little bit of diligence or a little bit of guesswork as to whether or not the court would support the claim that you're going with for the project. But it gets more complicated in other places too. So on the left, we have an example of a project that's owned by the state, but logging rights are granted to a company, and that company enrolled for carbon credits. So is land tenure secure there? Well, it's only as secure as the state's own government, right? So there have been a number of examples of this happening. I think Indonesia is the biggest example, where the government of Indonesia granted rights to a company to do carbon credits or to do logging on that land, and then decided to take those rights away. And in Indonesia, it was because of a big political shift. They became very anti-carbon, and then that whole project became threatened. So this is something we also have to consider. If the land is kind of only leased or owned by the state, what is the likelihood of that state changing its mind at some point in the decades of the project? And then, here's a worst case scenario here, where the land was claimed to be owned by a company, but it was also claimed to be owned by the government of Brazil. And this was a dispute that lasted for decades. It was in court. It was eventually resolved in favor of the company. But while this dispute went on, the project had to be placed on hold, and revenue couldn't make it to the project, and this was a very long and drawn out affair. So it goes to show that, I guess, you're never necessarily going to get it right if you're operating in a place without complete land tenure. The absolute best thing you can do in terms of diligence is to consult a local lawyer, but that's a difficult thing to do in every different country. We're keeping on land tenure here. So we have another couple of examples. So this is a project that enrolled a bunch of land and used an old deed and an old proof of sale that this was land that they owned. But again, this is kind of the point that I brought up with the military junta and whatnot. The courts had declared earlier, much earlier, 10 years before the project started, that deed, and in fact all deeds sourcing from that era of political instability, weren't valid. So the project declared that they owned the land, and they presented this deed, and it looked very above board. I mean, it's very hard to suss this out. But a court had actually, there was a court case 10 years earlier that had invalidated all deeds from this window of time within that country because of this political instability. And another really worst case scenario is that there have been quite a few projects in the voluntary carbon markets where people enroll land that just doesn't belong to them. This is an example of a project in Brazil on the right here. This project enrolled land without, people's land without telling them. It's worth noting this project developer was, an American based in the United States, had very little relationship to this land that they were enrolling. So this was patently illegal, and again, this is being worked through in the court system. But this project got quite a ways through its development cycle before this was caught, and so you wouldn't want something like this happening if you were buying carbon credits or investing in carbon credits. Okay, so that we covered land tenure pretty thoroughly, but the next question is, what is the history of the land? And so we really need to ask here, does the land have some sort of history that would make carbon credits on it not a great idea? So here's an example. A lot of land in the developing world was seized from people by autocratic governments in living memory. And it's not necessarily fair for the autocratic governments to seize people's land and then enroll it for carbon credits. This is what's happened in Cambodia, for example. The Cambodian government has seized a bunch of land from people who have lived on it for generations, and then very rapidly enrolled that land into carbon projects, and the government, of course, is the one that collects the money from the carbon. This is obviously quite bad, but it gets quite nebulous because, I mean, all land, to some extent, was probably seized from someone at some point in history. And Native American land, for example, in the United States was obviously seized from Native Americans, 100-something years ago. I wouldn't necessarily say that precludes us from enrolling private land in the United States or Canada. These are tricky questions to answer. But in general, when I was assessing carbon projects, and Renoster's rule of thumb was living memory. So could there still be someone alive who had the land seized from them, and that is now being enrolled in the carbon credits? And that, roughly puts you at something like an 80-year time span. And in general, just like what the history of the land is, just in general. Because, we can envision lots of historically bad things happening on land, especially if it's government owned, and maybe we don't want carbon credits coming off of that area. There are complicated cases in this situation as well. And again, we'll go to Brazil. In the 1970s, Brazil had a military dictatorship, and a lot of land was seized from indigenous people. That land was taken and redistributed often to supporters of the military regime. So is it fair to have a carbon project in these places? These are the places that are being hit the hardest by deforestation. And the 1970s is a pretty long time ago at this point. And it's really hard to say, like, oh, we shouldn't be trying to stop, Brazilian deforestation in these places. And a lot of times it's like grandchildren at this point who own the land. In the case of Brazil, I think we have to kind of answer, like, yeah, the good outweighs the bad, because the Amazon is being deforested just so quickly. We do often need to work with private landowners who, decades ago, their family was, got the land in some unsavory way. So moving on from land history, we want to talk about the project proponent. And what I mean by that is the actual owner of the land, the timber company, the community, the government, whoever it happens to be. And what we want to ask is, what are their history? Does that group have a record of doing good? Have they managed their land responsibly in the past? If you're doing a carbon project, maybe the answer is no, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Do they have any scandals around unlawful logging, displacing residents, mistreating workers? Is there a community that represents them, or did the project developer create their own community in a sense? What do I mean by that last point? It's quite common in REDD+ programs for like a large Western project developer to essentially bring a whole bunch of disparate communities together. Maybe they don't even like each other. In some cases of REDD+ projects that have been quite scandalous, these are communities that have had massive disputes with each other for decades. They bring them together into these projects, form a community council that didn't exist before that, and the whole thing falls apart after 5 years. That's one scenario. Sometimes we'll see community councils that are formed out of kind of nothing. So the project developer is kind of taking people who are going to benefit the most from the project, like, I don't know, local strongmen or something, and putting them into a council and saying they represent the community when they really don't. So let's go through a couple of examples. This project on the right here is one of my favorite carbon projects. It's the TIST program. not absolutely perfect, but I really like what they're doing. And it consists of a series of deeply impoverished small farmers who are encouraged to plant trees in Uganda, Kenya, and India. And they actually work with 260,000 small farmers. So you can really see in their accounting data exactly who's enrolled and exactly who's being paid and exactly how the project governance works. But this is an example of on the left here, we have an example of a situation that isn't so good. This is a REDD+ avoided deforestation project in Brazil being operated by a timber company. And that timber company currently has an embargo for mistreating its workers. So they were housing their workers in appalling conditions. They were not letting them have the state-mandated levels of breaks. I'm talking really bad situations here. So that timber company is currently in trouble with the Brazilian government. It operates 2 large REDD+ projects. You probably don't want to be buying carbon credits from this company. Going further into project proponents, let's look at some other examples of some really problematic projects. So on the right here, we have an example of a project that's run by the Cambodian government. The Cambodian government itself is accused of very serious human rights violations. And some of their greatest persecutions against people have been persecutions against activists who protest deforestation in the country. In fact, the country of Cambodia has arrested and locked up people for more than a decade now who pointed out that deforestation was happening in their own avoided deforestation project. So there are whistleblowers who came forward and said there's deforestation happening in this government-run avoided deforestation project, and the nation of Cambodia has locked them up. So I would be very hesitant to work with a project that is kind of co-run by the Cambodian government on these grounds. There's been very clear links between the Cambodian government and the groups doing the deforestation. So the government is literally profiting from an avoided deforestation project that is not particularly successful, and also profiting from the deforestation which is happening through government channels. So lots of problems in Cambodia. This is why you got to watch out for who's enrolling the projects, even if it is a government. And here's another example of a project gone kind of awry. This is a project that took place on community land in Colombia, but the community leader who signed off for the project didn't have authority to do so. And this is a very common problem. I've seen this in Brazil and in Colombia a bunch of times, where the project developer really, really wants to enroll this land, and they will essentially hit up community members until they get a yes. And it's sometimes unclear how these community governments organizations work, or sometimes it is clear, but you can still convince an outside party that you have community sign-off. In this case, they didn't, and the communities successfully sued and proved that they didn't give community consent. It was just this one community leader who didn't have the authority to do that. So this actually happens, I would say, we've seen this happen maybe 5 times or so in the REDD+ space. A lot of these problems are focused on REDD+ projects, but I assure you we'll move on to other project types as we get through the rubric here. The next and maybe the most important thing about people and organizations is the project developer. So who is actually developing the project? Who's writing the project documentation? That's incredibly important. And what's their history of doing so? So at Renostra, when we were doing diligence, we would actually try to assess the individual people who were responsible for writing the project. And the reason that that's quite important is that there's only so many people in the carbon markets floating around out there. And a lot of the same people who created the most scandalous carbon projects in the past are still operating in this space, just under different names, like under different company names. I'll give you an example. Like the people who created two of the most infamously bad carbon projects, like the Kariba baseline, and one of the people who created like the Big Coast gerrymandered Canadian project, they still operate and still create carbon projects for people. And the Kariba folks, they moved on from South Pole and they work for a new carbon project developer now. They're quite defensive of their historic work, even though scientifically what they've been done has been shown to be bunk. And so, if you're investing in a carbon project, you might want to know in advance that the person who created that carbon project is also the person responsible for the Kariba mess. You might reduce your level of inherent trust if that was the case. So Does the carbon project developer have a history of success? Have they created carbon projects before? Do they have a history of overissuance? And I would say this should apply at a personal level, because there are operators in this market who are prolific, the carbon cowboys that we all know of, that you probably should not be doing business with. So look into who you're doing business with, and look into the employees that they're employing. Does that developer have a history of human rights violations? Obviously, this is a major concern. I would say the carbon project developer with the greatest number of human rights violations, with like Human Rights Watch reports written about them, continues to operate with impunity in this space. And then who oversees development and management of the project? You know, what is their what is their personal involvement in the company? What are their roles and what are their backgrounds? And so, you know, it's important to assess this from both a kind of tampering type of perspective, but also from an experience perspective. Developing carbon projects is extremely difficult. It takes longer than everyone thinks it's going to take. Even industry insiders who have been doing this for 20 years are continuously flabbergasted at how long it takes to develop a carbon project. So, you know, I say this to warn you to just be a little careful around people who are very charismatic and have like very optimistic timelines without great amounts of experience in the molasses of the bureaucracy of the carbon markets. And then I would also say, like, you know, too much experience can also be kind of a bad thing, because if you've been floating around the markets for too long, you probably have a ghost or two in your closets. So there's no right answer, but just like know your customer, I think, is the answer here. So here's a couple of examples. This project developer, this Red Plus project developer, has been accused of human rights violations. In some cases, employees were directly responsible. They continue to operate with impunity. They've never suffered any real penalties. Their projects are still active, including the ones that have Human Rights Watch reports written about them. So they are one of the larger project developers in the nature-based space, and you really got to be careful to avoid them. On the right here, we have another example here. This is a project developer. It is one of the industry's largest. Renoster's reviewed, the slide's actually out of date, we've reviewed about a dozen of their carbon projects and found manipulation in all of them. So every single one of them, we found some level of manipulation to receive too many carbon credits. And so the biggest example here was Kariba, which is what you see on the top right. That's infamous now. But all their other little projects that aren't headline projects all had similar types of manipulation. So here's one on the bottom right from the same project developer. They've gerrymandered areas and are claiming credits for trees that they didn't plant. So they're just a prolific bad actor in this space, and you just have to be careful to avoid them. On the other hand, there's examples of really good project developers, you know, always being conservative and always being really safe. And so obviously, if you're buying a lot of carbon credits in the space, you want to identify who those groups are and work with them if you can. So this is an improved forest management developer that has a really long history of creating baselines that are much more conservative than what the protocol requires. I realize there's not enough information on the slide to actually know who that is. I'm talking about the Conservation Fund here. And then on the right here, this is a project developer that, you know, they have a dicey track record in terms of their Red Plus project's performance, but in terms of the numbers, they've always done quite well. They've always been very overly conservative in their issuance. And so this project here is Manoa. It probably should be getting more carbon credits than they claim, but because the project developer was pretty cautious in how they developed their methodology, and they used a really professional set of tools, it's stood up, even though this project is 15 plus years old at this point. And then, you know, here's that example that I talked about in Canada. This is a project that was aided with the help of a technical consultant, which is quite common in the carbon markets, who helped gerrymander this project and basically draw just tiny little squiggly lines around bits of trees that they couldn't harvest because it was too steep, or they didn't want to harvest because it was on a road, and that's aesthetically not great. And so this is really, I mean, we consider this to be cheating. You know, I think the key note here is that it wasn't just the developer who did this. It was this kind of technical consultant that they hired from without. And we're pretty familiar with this technical consultant. We when we were doing diligence, we did maintain a list of of naughty players, and they of course were on the list. This is pretty important if you're jumping into a project to kind of get to know who's doing it. If you don't have the technical chops, you could at least look into their background for scandals. The next point that we're going to move on to is legality. So, is the project legally authorized to take place? Does the project require government approval? Does the project take place on land that has like legal requirements that would prevent them from like doing forest harvesting or something like that? So let's go through maybe a couple of examples. In the United States, starting a carbon project is pretty light on carbon regulation. But for example, there is one state in the United States that's considering some like regulation around carbon markets, and New Hampshire is that case where they're requiring, I think, a tax for carbon credits. So in this case, I'd want to know if the tax is being, worked into the financial numbers. In the state of Maine, it now has a reporting system, so you're required to report on it. But for the most part, the United States is pretty laissez-faire on their carbon credits. But numerous countries have started putting moratoriums on carbon projects, and part of that is because they want to claim this land for their own national commitments through Article 6, through the UN Paris Climate Accords Article 6 program, which allows whole countries to claim essentially carbon credits or claim the benefit of reducing deforestation against their own emissions. And so countries are starting to say, well, hey, you can't just like enroll vast swaths of our public land or even our private land because we're going to claim this nationally. So Indonesia and Papua New Guinea have recently, kind of put moratoriums. And I don't know if this is the most recent slide deck because I think they were all working through this. Quite a few countries at this point have quite robust rules around what is allowed and what isn't allowed in terms of carbon crediting. And so just make sure that the program is in compliance with that. Next, we want to talk about political environment. There's a lot to cover here, and I'm not a sociologist, so I can't go too deep into this. But what we essentially want to ask is, could the socio-political climate be adverse to carbon projects? There's a couple of sub-questions that we need to consider here. The first is, what is public opinion in terms of carbon projects? Carbon projects have misbehaved a lot in the past, and people are very skeptical of them. And so if you go to a place like Zimbabwe, where there was this gigantic scandal in Kariba, where this big company took, hundreds of millions of dollars in carbon credits, and they walked away from the program, and most people didn't get paid any money at all. People on the ground in Zimbabwe are very skeptical that another carbon project could work. Rightfully so. And Zimbabwe, they passed a bunch of laws to try to help this situation. The same thing happened in New Hampshire. So why is New Hampshire now considering a carbon tax? It's because a big project developer violated state law. That state law was in place to require some level of harvesting so that a local mill wouldn't be impacted if the land got conserved. That mill, a big project did come in, shut down all harvesting. That mill laid off a bunch of people. There's still this ongoing situation in that state. It was something like 11% of the state's land, so it's a huge area. And people in the state are very unhappy with carbon credits right now because of the way that this project developer acted. So there's this concern about, I would say license to operate on the ground. It's growing thin in many areas. The other big question we want to ask is, are there ongoing legal disputes that could relate to carbon projects? There is litigation in several countries that could impact carbon projects in some way. So we could expect some new law to pass that would make carbon projects harder. Are there potential scandals at the national level that could emerge? So I've harped on about the Cambodian government. You could create the best carbon project in the entire world in Cambodia, but I think it's an inherent risk to do so because of just how many scandals there are in carbon projects in Cambodia already. and they're going to keep unfolding, and it is probably going to impact your project to some degree, even if it means you just be having a hard time selling the credits for very much money. Probably should dwell here. Obviously, the other big elephant in the room is the government stable at all? And there have been a number of cases of carbon projects taking place in countries in which there's been a coup, and it's not clear what the what the legal system looks like in that country. Gabon was an early example of a country that tried to enroll for Article 6, and then there was a coup only a few months later, and I don't know what the current military dictatorship's plans are in terms of this carbon project, but it certainly hasn't risen to the top of issues in Gabon. So this is definitely worth considering. And I mean, countries can be inherently politically unstable without being like dramatically unstable. And let's go to the United States for the proof of the pudding there, because so far carbon credits and carbon projects in the United States are quite secure, and I think that's likely to be the case because they're mostly private transactions. But one could envision like the Trump administration cracking down on California and somehow disrupting the California Air Resource Board compliance market. And I don't know what that would look like, but it's definitely not hard to imagine. And another case is Indonesia, where a pretty right-wing government took over from a otherwise fairly left-wing government and cracked down on a bunch of carbon projects in Indonesia, caused a lot of trouble for them. I think the courts sided with the projects, so like the authoritarianish government of Indonesia wasn't really able to get away with much, but it posed a big risk. And like Indonesia has a pretty stable government. It's just that I think it's fair to say that if like extreme right-wing political actors get into office, they can often look at the land and say, hey, we should be extracting natural resources from these areas, and that could obviously threaten the project. So, be on the lookout for that, even though it's kind of global at this point. All right, next I want to talk about budget. And this is probably most important in terms of a project that's kind of still launching, because you want to make sure that the budget that they forecast is likely to really be the case. The first question that we need to ask is, does the project have a budget? Which, I mean, surprisingly, many projects don't. The second question that we have to ask is the budget balanced? You would be surprised how many project budgets I've come across that, they'll say, like, this is what we're going to spend our money on, and this is how much it's going to cost. But nowhere are they saying, like, here's the revenue, and the two meet each other. So I have an example on the right. This project goes into great detail on its budget. There's lots of examples of this on the carbon markets. I wish that carbon market budgets were made public. They should be. I mean, these are projects run for the public good. And I would say, like, Equitable Earth, for example, does require that projects make their budget public. But you'll have to probably sign some sort of NDA to get access to this. But, here's an example of a worst-case scenario where this is a REDD+ project that we recently reviewed, hadn't come online yet. They were saying that they were going to sell their carbon credits for $12.50 a ton in order to be able to deliver co-benefits. The average sale price of REDD+ credits is $5. Now, definitely high-quality REDD+ projects will sell for $12.50. Not sure that I could put this project into that bin. And so it's fairly risky to be considering this project because, when the budget falls through and it doesn't add up, what always ends up happening is co-benefits are the first thing that are sliced, right? It's people in the ground who don't get paid. And this has happened over and over again. People would argue that this happened in, Caribe, in Maidambe, in the Bosques Amazonicas Brazil nuts. These are all REDD+ projects that, didn't earn enough money, and so somehow it was the people who are actually doing the work who didn't get paid. This is an inherent threat to the project's continued existence, and it also is terrible. I mean, it's essentially like depriving people of a natural resource. Anyway, you know this already. So, the next thing that we want to ask is the timeline. Is the timeline reasonable? Does the project propose a very explicit timeline broken out by quarters? Does it not have a timeline at all? Here's an example of a project on the left that doesn't include a timeline, and the reason for that is they didn't intend to do anything. This was basically a Red Plus project just enrolling a bunch of land that wasn't at great risk, and they didn't have any patrols set up. They're just going to enroll the land and walk away. And so it's fair for them not to have a timeline because there isn't any actual work being done. But on the right here, we have an example of a project that has a very beautifully detailed timeline in which you can see exactly all the activities they're proposing and how long those activities are going to take and all that. It's obviously worth mentioning that right now in 2025, projects are taking a very long time to develop. There's a couple of drivers behind that. First of all, Vera and the American Carbon Registry are operating extremely slowly, and they're operating at losses every year, and they're putting people on a waiting list that is in sometimes 1 to 2 years long to get carbon credits. So that's an inherent problem. Another big issue is buyers are taking an enormous amount of time to decide before they buy. I think that diligence frameworks are currently running at something like a year. So you need to spend a year in diligence with a buyer before they'll commit to buy your credits. It's a buyer's market. After all the scandals, there's not too many buyers left in the market. And so I think project developers consistently think that they can get something off the ground quickly, and then they don't. And then, that obviously affects the project's ability to operate. I mean, if they planted trees and those trees need care, then do they have the money to follow up with that? I think that those are the big drivers. I think the other thing that has historically happened is Silicon Valley optimists, like tech CEOs and stuff, have, they always propose crazy timelines. Elon Musk is always saying he's going to land on Mars in 3 years. And they do the same in the carbon markets. And, they'll say we've got a CDR project that is just 5 years away from producing a gigaton of carbon. Really take that with a grain of salt. I mean, consider the source. Is it coming from a scientist who is really well versed in the problems, or is it coming from a Silicon Valley optimist CEO-y type of person? Escaping from nature-based, the CDR market has a decade or more of failures to live up to their timelines. They consistently have been falling behind. This goes for all gigantic CO2 vacuum-y type of projects. They have kind of under-delivered relative to the timelines they promised it, and it is a very difficult engineering challenge. But you should be aware of this before you invest, and consider what their historic record is of coming in on time, and also consider who's telling you this, because it should always be a cynical and grizzled scientist who you're getting your timeline from. Okay, governance. Does the project have a well-defined governance structure suitable to its size and scope? What do I mean by this? Is there a clear indication of who is doing what in the project? Are people named? Is there a clear ground organization? Is there technical capability that is assigned to people? So, on the right, I have an example of a governance structure found in a PDD that is really explicit. I love this because you have really who's in charge of what and who's on these teams, and it really farms out who the responsibilities going forward for this project. On the other hand, we obviously if we're going to go back to Kariba, our favorite project, they had no governance structure whatsoever. This was run through a shell company by one very rich Zimbabwean guy. He would basically just transfer money from this shell company in Guernsey, take wads of cash, and then drive around in his Jeep handing out those cash before verifiers would arrive. And he would basically just hand out wads of cash to the local strongmen. So this is the worst type of governance that you could imagine. But in general, we just want to know, is there a framework by which company employees and the developer is going to take responsibility and do tasks and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, I would say communities, councils can play a very large role in governance too, and we'd want to know what the role is between the developer and the project proponent, the landowners. Okay, so as we move into the more scientific assessment portion of the video here, I'm going to actually kind of switch between two different slide decks. These cover kind of two different lectures that I want to consider. So, the first big section of the scientific review is additionality. And the question, of course, there is just, is the project justified in existing? Are the carbon credits really necessary to make sure that the project takes place? And, from my perspective, I would say that there are some projects that have pretty sound additionality. We really can't question them too much. Direct air capture, there's no real other reason to be doing that other than the carbon credits. Mangroves, oftentimes the same kind of thing. Biochar, etc. But, in terms of the nature-based space, we do often have to ask whether or not, this action was happening anyway. And I would also put renewable energy credits in that category as well, because there is a transition to renewable energy that's worldwide, and we have to really consider whether or not the carbon credits are playing a role in that. So let's maybe go over what the larger types of additionality are that we have to consider, and then we'll go over how Renoster would do those checks. So the first is, I would say, regulatory surplus, and the argument here is the project's behavior required by the law? Some nations and states require that electricity providers build renewable power, and so if that's the case, then it doesn't necessarily make sense for that renewable power to also be receiving carbon credits, for example. Many nations forbid forest harvesting around streams. They often require restoration around streams. This is very important for watersheds, affecting large swaths of people. And so it doesn't make much sense to have a carbon project that takes place within a protected buffer or within a place that it has mandated restoration. But when considering regulatory surplus, we also have to consider whether or not people are actually following the law, because worldwide governments create laws that are oftentimes more aspirational than regulatory. So we have to consider the rate of adherence to the law. As the most general example, clear-cutting rainforest is illegal in most countries. You are not allowed to clear-cut the Amazon for the most part. And yet, obviously, Amazon deforestation is one of the biggest drivers of climate change that we can point to in the nature-based space. We wouldn't necessarily want to rule out an avoided deforestation project in the Amazon just because it's illegal to cut there if everybody is cutting there anyway. Sometimes it gets very nuanced. And sometimes I will say, laws are only enforced in wealthier areas, or they're only enforced for certain types of, companies. So here's an example in Brazil. On the left, we have a carbon project that was planting trees along riparian corridors, that is stream buffers and whatnot. And there already is a law in Brazil that says you have to do that. In this part of Brazil, a very poor and rural area, where, it's all small farmers, more or less, nobody is doing this. The law is not being followed whatsoever. It's very easy to see that in a satellite image of these riparian areas and see that nobody's done any restoration. So we found this project to be really impactful, really additional. But on the right hand, we have an example of a timber company in Brazil enrolling trees that they planted in riparian areas in a more wealthy area of the country, in which, large timber companies do seem to be forced to comply with this law. So it did not make sense to us to be issuing carbon credits in this case. Same law, same country, but different levels of enforcement and applied to different people. They're not going after small farmers, but they are going after billion-dollar timber companies. The other thing about, laws is they can be squishy, so they can be vague. One example is, Canada and the United States places harvest limits on trees near water bodies, but those leave room for, different types of management or different types of interpretation. I think that, laws can also be soft because they can offer kind of incentives rather than hard requirements. So Panama, for example, offers incentives for reforestation. They can be tax breaks, or they can be direct payments from the government. And if you're already being paid, or if you're already being paid through tax breaks to do reforestation, then you probably shouldn't be getting carbon credits for the same work. Sometimes a case can be made that you need two forms of payment in order to make it work. Project costs $100. This is giving you 50. This is giving you another 50. And that's fine. But I would say that's often not the case. And you want to see how imbalanced the payments are. Another point that we need to make about regulatory surplus or laws around additionality is there is a difference between statutory law and civil law in most countries. So statutory law refers to there is a law in place that says you can or can't do this. Civil law refers to contract obligations. So you may still be obligated under a contract, under a deed restriction, an easement. Maybe a wealthy donor has contributed to your whatever, and their stipulation was that you don't cut the trees. This is actually quite common in American IFM projects. And legal rulings can also kind of be a civil or a soft form of regulatory surplus. You don't want to enroll in some place that somebody already has to maintain, forest on, or already has to do this work on by some sort of contract enforcement. So the biggest example is in the United States. The Nature Conservancy was enrolling very large areas of their land. The Nature Conservancy is not allowed to clear cut their forests. They have bylaws, organizational bylaws, and a civil regulatory structure that prevents them from going nuts on their land. They are the Nature Conservancy after all. So the next portion that I want to talk about is financial additionality. So we talked about whether or not a project is required by law, but we also want to look at whether or not a project is required by financing. So if a project has certain carbon revenue streams, would it have been financially viable without the carbon program? So I guess the best example is timber. If you're planting trees for timber, would you have made enough money from the timber anyway to do this work? Or are the carbon credits necessary? We always want to make sure that the payments from the carbon credits are necessary to make it work. And I'll give you one example, this one on the right. We did the math on this project a couple of years ago, and we found that less than 10% of the revenue was coming from carbon credits, and 90% of the revenue was actually coming from the timber proceeds. So it really made us skeptical that these eucalyptus plantations, which were being planted by a timber company that obviously always plants trees, it really made us skeptical that these credits had any impact on these trees being planted. For renewable energy projects, we would also want to know whether or not the project was already paying for itself. Is it does it just make sense to build a wind farm somewhere given the economics of 2025, as opposed to needing some sort of subsidy from carbon credits? So the best way of doing this is financial modeling, and usually this is done by looking at two different financial models, one with the project and one without the project's finances. And if you can determine that the project is still financially viable to do without the carbon credits, then you might raise questions. I'll get into this in a bit more. The most fundamental form of additionality check is a common practice test. And what I mean by this is you want to think to yourself, are other people doing this all over the same region without the incentive of carbon offsets? Is this a common practice regardless of the carbon offsets? And if it is, you would then wonder, why are carbon offsets needed if 100 other farmers are able to do this kind of thing? Remote sensing is extremely helpful in answering this question impartially. So here's a couple examples. Renewable energy. We have wind turbines right next to a project that's receiving renewable energy credits for wind turbines, and they aren't receiving credits. So how is it that the company was able to build these but not these, right? Eucalyptus plantations in blue on the top right are eucalyptus plantations that are planted, by timber companies, and the little white areas are the ones enrolled in this project. So very clearly, it is economically viable to plant trees without carbon credits here. And down here in the bottom right, we have another example where restoration of a mangrove area was already taking place and had already happened in the yellow areas, but the white areas were the ones they were enrolling. So one might assume that the yellow areas would have continued to expand. Now, to be fair, the yellow areas, that was 30 years of restoration, and this is the white areas are being restored in 3 years. So clearly the project is doing great work. But one might assume that a little bit more restoration was likely to take place even without the project. Okay, so that's the overview of additionality, but now I want to get more into the nitty-gritty detail of some of the checks that we would run. And so one of the first checks that we would run is to make sure that there's a clarity in documentation. So I know this doesn't actually fit into any of the boxes that we just talked about, but this is an important part of additionality because you need to make sure that they're actually, doing something and documenting it. So is the project documentation up to date, and is it in conformance, or will it soon be in conformance with the standards? Does the project share the required data publicly? I would say most registries these days and the ICVCM have transparency requirements about them. Many carbon projects fail to meet those transparency requirements. Is the project's accounting clear and reproducible? Can you go from A to Z? Like, here's the raw measurements of whatever it is, to here's how many carbon credits are being issued. That should be a very clear and easy thing to do in the project's accounting documents. And does the project, share important information about the modeling approaches, the geospatial data, whatever it happens to be? So we have a couple of examples here. The project on the left failed to share even basic accounting information. This is a live IFM project on Vera. They don't even tell you how much carbon there is in the forest, how much deforestation happened historically. They don't tell you what their baseline is relative to any values, because they just give you raw numbers without a starting point. They don't tell you what their future baselines are going to be. Really basic stuff is just not being shared by this project. And, they hide behind a rationale that this massive timber company has a right to privacy, but, that's probably not the case if you're entering into the voluntary carbon market. You have to share some basic stuff. On the right here, we have a really good example where you can go online and actually see exactly where every single tree that this project planted is. The second point that I want to make is gerrymandering. And so this actually, of course, overlaps with the regulatory surplus that I was talking about here. What I want to ask is, are the project's boundaries being manipulated in any suspicious way? So are they enrolling places in which trees were likely to regrow anyway, in which soils were going to accumulate carbon no matter what under the current regime, or in which you're somehow mandated to restore the land? So gerrymandering is a political phenomenon in the United States where politicians are allowed to choose the maps of where their voters vote for them. So if I'm a state politician, I'm allowed to draw the areas of the places of the voters who are voting for me. Obviously, this is incredibly corrupt. And it's the same kind of deal in carbon project development, where developers are choosing very selectively the areas that they want to enroll. This happens in all types of forestry and maybe some types of ag projects. So to go through a couple of examples, it happens the most in improved forest management projects, where people are enrolling road buffers, islands, steep ravines, riversides. These are not necessarily areas that are illegal to harvest. Maybe they are. Maybe they're using some sort of funny logic, like the buffer thing I talked about. But in a lot of these cases, it's either undesirable to harvest along a road because of political backlash, or it's undesirable to it's not financially viable to go and cart out a log, a logging crew to a small island. So this actually touches on both types of additionality, regulatory and financial. On the project on the right here, we have them enrolling for removals credits for growth, but kind of seemingly selectively enrolling areas that had recently been cut. So the trees, actually, they were going to grow back anyway in these areas. That's a normal part of the timber rotation process. You probably shouldn't be enrolling for a removals project if you just cut the trees and replanted them. That's kind of baked into the system. Yeah, I mean, I guess for Red Plus, we also see this for avoided deforestation projects where people are enrolling little slivers of land that they deem that were not really desirable. And I think I have some examples later in the deck. So one of the other big important questions that we would ask in a review is, if this is an improved forest management project, we need to see that forest management is actually being improved upon, that there was a previous state that is being improved upon in some way. Bad IFM projects and developers will point to forests that have been protected for 100 plus years and say, well, I'm enrolling this for IFM because it could be harvested at some point. Well, if it could, why hasn't it been? Like, where's the financial case there for why it hasn't been already? Most of the time, the answer is that there's some sort of protection already in place for this land. I would point out that, IFM is not intended to be an avoided conversion methodology. If you are going to make the case that an area is going to be harvested or going to be converted in some way, you should do that through a methodology like avoided planned deforestation or avoided conversion. All right, this is maybe too in the weeds. Let's look at some examples. Bottom left, we have an IFM project that takes place on a university research forest. The trees have never been harvested in at least over 100 years. Doing so would ruin a number of very big, prestigious experiments at the very least. And it's almost impossible to imagine the university would sign off on this. As long as the university is in place, this forest will be preserved. On the bottom right, we have a forest that has been heavily degraded in the past. Thanks to this project, it appears that forest management may be a little bit more subtle in the future. If it's reforestation, one of the big questions we want to ask is, was it common anyway? This is the common practice test. Now, the three different types of additionality that I talked about, they obviously overlap one another. My suggestion to you would be to focus on the satellite imagery rather than financial models, because it is really easy to manipulate financial models. It is very easy to make any sort of financial case that you want. I know I have a forest mensuration background. I know how easy it is to manipulate the growth of trees or future timber projections and whatnot. People will always be able to make that financial case. But what's happening in the satellite imagery is an ironclad proof that, planting trees in this area was already the desirable outcome. So these are these two examples here on the left and the right. We have our eucalyptus plantations where that's very common. And on the right, we have a Central American eucalyptus plantation where it's not common at all for people to plant eucalyptus. This is taking place on a small farm, so it's not owned by a timber company. And no other farmers in the region had actually done this. So you can't have financial additionality for eucalyptus plantations. It just needs to be the case that it's not financially desirable for most farmers. Yeah, I mean, in considering this, I would also consider whether or not these are timber companies or farmers. Like I said, timber companies always have this kind of larger financial framework that they work in, and I would always be a little bit more suspicious of reforestation that they're doing. Because obviously their whole job is to reforest and plant trees and grow them and cut them down. One of the big things we need to ask also about reforestation is, was there forest on the land prior to this project? Now, this gets a little bit into the land use history that we talked about earlier on, but we do not want to see trees being planted on areas that were recently deforested. And there are a couple of examples here. So this project on the left is a Vera project where the landowner clear-cut this native rainforest, planted eucalyptus trees. The eucalyptus trees grew to full size. They were credited with a lot of carbon credits, and then they died because of an insect outbreak. Eucalyptus being a monoculture was much less resilient to insect than the native rainforest that they clear cut. So this is one of the worst projects on Vera's platform as far as I'm concerned. It's done enormous amounts of damage to the environment. But, the problem gets even more subtle than that, because there are a lot of projects that are planting trees on areas that were recently forested 4 or 5 years ago, but they'll make the claim that it's a different landowner who bought the land, and that landowner has all the best intentions to restore what was cut. That sounds great, and it is great to do that. But from a carbon market perspective, it's not a very good thing to be planting trees on land that was recently clear-cut, even if it's a different landowner, because you're still creating a financial incentive for the bad guys to go and clear-cut trees and then flip land. That is the primary reason that they do this kind of stuff, because there's a buyer for this land, and if you're buying the land at the market rate and then replanting trees on it, you're creating an incentive for them to do this again next door. So this is a real big problem in the markets right now, I would say. historically, 5 years ago, all of the methodologies had rules against this. Today, all of the methodologies have repealed those rules. So Vera and Gold Standard have repealed their rules against planting trees on land that had forest a long time ago. And the rationale behind that is that, it's good to replant on areas that were just cut. But it creates this perverse financial incentive that could lead to a lot more deforestation. So we don't like to see it. One of the biggest questions is for additionality that we also want to ask is if this is IFM or REDD+, is there even a risk of forest loss to begin with? We have to consider the accessibility of the site. So on the right here, we have sites that are completely inaccessible. There's no road access. Deforestation is maybe happening 50, 100 kilometers away, and it's hard to imagine in the 30 years of the project that they would get to this point. This project on the right here is taking place in the Andes. This project down here is taking place in the Colombian Amazon. There's just no deforestation, and there's no ability for deforestation in these places. And we also want to ask, is there some pre-existing reason for them not to cut the trees? Here's a unique and weird example here in this box right here. This is a recreational ski slope in the United States that's enrolling this land, and the baseline claims that we would have clear cut pretty much all these trees. Well, apart from the financial models saying that it makes financial sense to clear cut everything, it doesn't make too much financial sense for a ski area to be clear cutting the trees around the ski slopes. But obviously there are great examples too. These two avoided deforestation projects on the right have, if not completely stopped deforestation, probably dramatically slowed it down. Next, we want to ask, and I'm lumping this into additionality too. Does the project receive retroactive credits for stuff that happened before it was registered? There's a fundamental problem here that takes place on most of the carbon registries, but especially ACR and Vera, which is that you are allowed to claim credits for up to 5 years before you actually submitted the project. If you've been doing this work for 5 years without revenue, why do you actually need revenue now to continue doing this work? How are you able to plant those trees? How are you able to protect this forest area without these funds? And, if you were able to do that, then, what good is the money doing now? So that's one problem. Another more insidious problem is, especially with avoided deforestation, what people will do is they'll draw their boundaries just around areas that have not been deforested to date. So maybe the area has not been protected at all, and the macro area has been deforested by 25%. It is not fair to enroll the remaining 75% of that area and claim 5 years worth of credits for that. You weren't doing any protection. These are just the areas that they didn't manage to get to. I think that this is a really sneaky problem. The last big issue with this problem is that by claiming credits for up to 5 years beforehand, you essentially cut the length of your project by 5 years. So whatever permanence you're claiming, and it's probably going to be 30 years if you're on Vera, in reality, it's a 25-year project. Now, this can take, I do want to say that there are instances in which people buy land or do this work and very explicitly say, we're setting some money aside, we took a loan out, and this is only going to work out if we get carbon credits in advance. So that does happen. So this project on the left is run by the Conservation Fund. They do go and buy land, and they are a conservation organization, so they do intend to conserve these areas, but they're only able to buy land knowing that there's going to be this financial return from carbon credits. So we would be okay with them enrolling a piece of land that they bought 3 years earlier. We do have to keep in mind it does take 2 years or so sometimes to enroll for carbon credits. But on the right, we have one of the most egregious and worst examples that I've ever seen. It is a non-additional project deep in the Colombian Amazon, no road access. The project claims carbon credits for work that was done 8 years before the project first submitted its PDD and started getting credits. There were no active interventions during those 8 years. And this project, one of the reasons I hate it so much is that they got this project in and certified, and they got 8 years worth of credits months before Vera made the declaration that they were going to change the way they did Red Plus baselines. So this project, it is a 2024 carbon project by our favorite developer, South Pole, receiving carbon credits using the old baseline approaches for 8 years worth of retroactive work, even though it's taking place in untouchable Amazon. In terms of financial additionality, let's double click on that. If you're reviewing financial models that the carbon project is proposing, make sure the finances make sense. And I don't know how best to say this other than that. Make sure there aren't any assumptions that are crazy, like how much they could sell the credits for. What the revenues would be from timber. Are they understating what timber revenues could be is one of the big questions. Growth rates are another thing that you might want to consider. What are the financial motivations for this work? And then again, I would say, whenever there's an instance in which you're making some amount of money off of a project apart from carbon credits, that obviously happens in ag, in nature-based, and in renewable energy because you're selling the products off the land. What is the ratio between carbon finance and those products? And if carbon finance occupies a pretty small amount of it, then it's probably safe to say that this is an afterthought. Are there monetary policy reasons for doing this work beyond carbon offsets? That could be, all kinds of things like the grants that we talked about, or other types of benefits that they could get from doing this work. And it's hard to nail down specific examples because every type of project will have different types of financial modeling. But again, I would say personally, I put a lot less weight in the financial modeling and the financial case because I know how easy that is to manipulate, and a lot more weight on the raw satellite data. If you're in the forestry space, people might be using something like net present value. This is a modeling assumption used to model when people would harvest trees based on how much they value money now versus later. It is a valuable tool for saying, without this carbon project, I really need money now, and therefore I would have cut the trees. But I will say, in the carbon markets, people often put a net present value that is much higher than what is observed in reality. So, in reality, the most aggressive people on the landscape are probably harvesting their trees at 5 to 6% net present value. You'll see people in the carbon markets claim 8. Most people are closer to 3 or 4%. But anyway, this gets too far in the weeds, and it's very difficult to speak to this for all the different project types. Okay, so let's talk about baselines next. So in what project types do baselines really matter? The answer is in a lot more than you might think. So a baseline basically describes what would have happened without the project. Would the trees have been cut down? Would they have built this green energy anyway? At what rate was a household appliance being adopted? Baselines are handled differently in different project types, and in many project types, this is flatly ignored. So, all right. I would consider baselines to be very important in nature-based projects, renewable energy projects, cook stoves, efficiency, heating, water, that kind of thing. Maybe it's a little important in mangrove restoration too. It is not so important in these projects in which there's kind of no question about this work being done. Direct air capture, biochar, emissions capture, livestock emissions capture, and actually, agricultural land management should probably be closer to the middle, over here. Okay. So how are baselines created? It really depends on project type. But they essentially are some sort of model that describes what would have happened on the project if not for the project. I don't know how deep we want to get into this here. For Red Plus projects, I think it's pretty well known at this point people were manipulating the crap out of their baselines. They were doing this in a couple ways. One way that they were doing it was they were drawing a reference region that they were pointing to say, hey, this is another area that's unprotected. Look at how much deforestation happened there. People were obviously drawing reference regions along highways and around cities and stuff. Another way that they were doing this was just flat out bad and inappropriate modeling. So for example, they would use unconstrained linear models that would just go up to 100%, or they would use these S curves that always end at 100% no matter what. So I don't want to dwell too much here. For Red Plus projects, there is a new form of baselining that uses a risk map. This is a risk map developed by a third party in which they're essentially trying to determine the probability of someone cutting the trees on that land. That is a much better way of doing it, but it still has problems that we'll talk about in a bit. Yeah, this gets into too much methodological nuance here. The gold standard for baselines are dynamic baselines. And so what do I mean by that? What the definition of a dynamic baseline is that a couple of things. The first is that it's very much like a medical study. The way that it's like a medical study is you are intended to identify a control group outside of your project that is doing something that is operating in a similar way. So a group of landowners outside of your project. And then you are supposed to follow that control group over time as the project progresses. Now that second point is what makes a dynamic baseline dynamic. Because every year of the project, you're looking at your control group and you're seeing what they did and you're issuing credits based on the difference. You can do a dynamic baseline for most project types, I would say. And again, this is very similar to like a medical study where you would administer a treatment to a treatment group. In this case, like it's reforestation, you're planting trees, that's the treatment. And then you hold a control group and you look at the differences there. And then you would say the effectiveness of the drug is the difference between the two groups. So that's how credits are issued. Credits are issued based on the difference between the control group of people outside the project and the actions of the project itself. This is undoubtedly the best type of baseline out there. Unfortunately, most carbon project methodologies still don't allow this. I mean, there's no excuse for that. I mean, focus on carbon project methodologies that do have a dynamic baseline is my recommendation there. If not, you can still certainly be conservative with other approaches. I will say that nearly all project types need to have some sort of baseline. This is an example of an agriculture project type in which the baseline is what they were doing before, which was nothing but corn, and now they're planting different crops, and that's going to lead to the accumulation of soil carbon. Cook stoves require a baseline. So baselines in cook stoves right now usually consist of surveys of participants, which is a really weak way of actually measuring your outcomes. I will say cook stoves are avoided deforestation projects. They are intended to stop people from cutting down trees in their area and using those trees to burn wood. And so the baseline for a cook stove project should be looking at deforestation rates in the immediate surroundings and making sure that whatever you do decreases them. You will not find a cook stove project that actually does that. But if you have some sort of sway on how these projects work, I encourage you to force people to do that. Industrial emissions projects require baselines of previous emissions a lot of the time. So, and then I would say renewable energy credits as well. You should have some sort of baseline that describes the implementation rate. So maybe at a rate of 5%, people are replacing fossil fuels with renewables already. If that's the case, then your project, some amount of your project was likely to take place already. The same can be said for cook stoves and other appliance type projects. If people are electrifying their households or adopting more efficient appliances already at some underlying rate because of the natural development of the economy in the region, that is a baseline that you need to take into account. How do you actually assess this? I would say it's difficult. And the best thing you can do is probably do your own baseline. Make your own dynamic baseline using remote sensing is the best. Apart from that, I would try to pick apart the assumptions in the baseline that they're using and just try to pick apart the model and see why might the model not be conservative? What are they not considering? It depends heavily on project type and even on methodology. So even a dynamic baseline is not a perfect solution. So like the ACR's implementation of dynamic baselines, I would say, is severely flawed. It is biased. It does not work very well. It only looks at loss. It doesn't look at the likelihood of regrowth. So it really does depend. I wish I had more specific advice, but I guess we should probably move on. Yeah, let's talk about leakage next. How do we actually assess this, and in what project types do we have to be worried about leakage? Oh, where did leakage go? So the big question here is, could this behavior lead to an increase in consumption or use of a resource outside of the project area that could lead to carbon, being emitted somewhere else? So could protecting a forest lead to another forest being cut down? Could a clean energy project lead to greater energy consumption overall? Or could, planting trees on land lead to people, farming cattle on another piece of land somewhere else? Leakage is often in conflict with additionality. And I will say, leakage is a much more nuanced case than what you probably have heard of. And we're going to get into that in a second here. But I'll say right now, if you can prove that somebody cut down another tree because of a tree you protected, what you've also done there is prove that you preserved a tree. So in what project types are we most concerned about leakage? The nature-based ones, again, grassland, afforestation, improved forest management. All these instances in which land is being taken away from some other resource. Renewable energy credits. I would say there is concern around leakage. And direct air capture, I would also say I have concerns around leakage, around this idea that you're taking renewable energy, that you're either, for renewable energy credits, the concern would be that you're just increasing capacity and you're not actually causing people to reduce emissions elsewhere. And with direct air capture, the concern would be that you are taking green energy that could have been used in a more sustainable way off of the market. And cook stoves, too. We would be worried for cook stoves about people essentially cooking more. For example, you give them 2 stoves, they might just use both. In fact, studies have shown that they do use both. So broadly speaking, let me hop to the other deck here. Broadly speaking, there are generally 2 types of leakage that people break leakage out into. One is geographic leakage, and this refers to direct leakage displacement that could occur because you took a piece of land and you changed its land use. So is a illegal timber logger going next door thanks to this chunk of trees that you protected and cutting down a tree next door? By planting trees, is someone literally being displaced and moving their farm down the road? So geographic leakage is the easy one, and we can usually detect some level of geographic leakage using remote sensing. The way that is often done is by identifying a buffer area around the project or a leakage belt and determining whether or not harvesting or agriculture increased in that leakage belt following the project. This is difficult to determine given other macroeconomic things going on. These are some examples. This is an example of a eucalyptus plantation that displaces cattle farming. Probably there was some cattle that was displaced from this, and that probably that cattle is going somewhere else because people have a decreased demand for cattle worldwide. This is a project that does monitor leakage with a leakage belt, and we were happy with the leakage belt approach that they used. There was some leakage, and we think that they quantified it and reported it. But by and far, I guess, following on the leakage belt, one of the things you have to make sure that a project is doing right is that they're not being sneaky with their leakage belt. This is an example of a project whose leakage belt was over 100 kilometers away on a different island. Make sure the leakage belt makes sense and is a representative area nearby the project. But market leakage is much more complicated than geographic leakage, and arguably all leakage is market leakage to an extent. What market leakage refers to is that if you're taking the supply of some asset off of the market, timber, cattle, agriculture, whatever it is, you are potentially driving up the price of that asset and causing people to somewhere else cut down trees, convert the land to agriculture or something like that. The thing about market leakage is that it's non-local. So just, because we operate in global markets, you could make the case that preserving some chunk of land in the United States leads to deforestation in the Amazon. And indeed, I think that there are cases in which kind of that has happened. I wouldn't point to carbon projects where we know that's the case, But for example, like the Northwest Forest Plan in the United States, where the U.S. government like locked up a bunch of wood in the 1990s, probably contributed to increased deforestation in Latin America. Okay, so how do we deal with market leakage? I would say the best way of dealing with market leakage is through economics modeling. There are economists that have developed very sophisticated models that balance supply and demand, first regionally and then globally, and then like determine whether or not some sort of like reduction in supply will lead to a supply shock and lead to people increasing supply elsewhere. The reason that projects don't always have just 100% leakage, there's a couple of them. Firstly, there's this thing called elasticity in economics, which states that like if you're just a drop in the bucket, you're not going to have that big of an impact. And in a lot of carbon projects, these are areas that are just too small to really be impacting the local timber markets in any significant way. Another reason that leakage isn't always that big a deal is that when you do reduce supply, it does drive prices up. That could lead people to cutting down trees elsewhere, but it could also lead people to reduce their consumption. So if toilet paper becomes very expensive, you are going to use less of it. Like studies have shown, you're going to buy 1-ply toilet paper instead of 2-ply toilet paper. So there is that market mechanism as well, that people will be more frugal. The other reason that leakage isn't always 100% is that what often happens is, rather than trying to onboard new land for like your supply, people will instead intensify their work on their existing land. So they'll maybe manage their forest better to get more timber out of it if they're able to get higher prices. This has been shown pretty concretely in certainly forestry economics work. And so you're not necessarily causing trees to get cut down somewhere else or causing land to like go into agriculture. Instead, you're probably improving a practice, because all of a sudden it's more worth it for them to spend more money on their land. So good forestry costs money. Good agriculture also costs money. It involves drones. It involves like sophisticated equipment, all that stuff. If you're not receiving that much money for your forest product, you're not going to invest that money. But if you are receiving more money, you'll put more effort into getting more wood off your land. So those are some big contributing factors for why leakage is not that big a deal. But there's an even more important point about leakage that we need to consider, which is that leakage is temporal. What I mean by temporal is that leakage doesn't actually result in people cutting down a rainforest or to like grow ag or to get trees. Instead, it results in people cutting down a rainforest sooner. So that is best illustrated in this conservation project right here. A 1985 satellite image shows that the entire area was more or less forest before. This area was conserved in the 90s, and it is the only place left. From a traditional point of view, you might say that this conservation project resulted in gigantic amounts of leakage, because people literally did go next door and cut down trees. But intuitively, when we look at this satellite image, all we're seeing left is the area that was conserved. And so there is a lot of carbon on this land that we can say is still there thanks to this project. This project should not receive a leakage discount at all. And the reason for that is because economic theory tells us that people will exploit a natural resource to its maximum degree before reaching some sort of equilibrium. And so if we're talking about native rainforest right here, every splotch of native rainforest that is not conserved in some way is going to get cut down. Now, in a lot of places, conservation does work, and so we haven't cut down these areas, and in a lot of places we haven't gotten to places that are going to get cut down because we're still working towards them, and hopefully conservation will take place before then. But eventually, every ecosystem will reach a steady state like this, and once that occurs, there is no leakage on the areas that you conserved, because essentially all you've done is encourage people to cut down trees a little bit earlier than they otherwise would have. By conserving this land, somebody did go next door and cut down this tree earlier. but they maybe only did so 1 or 2 years before they were actually going to do that. Leakage is not so much an offsetting of emissions to somewhere else. It is a temporal offsetting. So what you are actually doing is causing somebody to cut down trees 5 years earlier than they would have. That is the case for reforestation and for IFM too. For improved forest management, you might also be causing people to cut down the trees in the region beforehand. You might be causing to cut down a tree at 12 centimeters instead of 13 centimeters or something like that. That tree was going to get cut. At some point, that, and any tree within a commercial cycle is going to get cut, and so causing it to get cut earlier is not great, but it's not as bad as causing it to get cut in the first place. So why do I say this? People dramatically overstate how bad leakage is in the carbon markets. Leakage is bad, but if you're causing a tree to get cut down 5 years in advance, that does not have the same carbon impact as it getting cut down in general. And in fact, you can use very sophisticated atmospheric modeling approaches to model out what the damage is by cutting a tree down 5 years earlier. I would love to write a scientific paper about this, but I'm too busy. I think I've made the point. Okay, use economics models. That's the best case. There's very few methodologies that allow that right now, but it is becoming more adopted quickly. Geographic leakage should be spotted using an appropriate leakage belt, and market leakage is a nebulous and difficult concept, and I wouldn't go ham on a project's score because of it. What about other project types? Renewable energy. Leakage can occur in renewable energy when you just increase demand and expand the market, and that leads to people not actually reducing their fossil fuel emissions. So I think we're all kind of familiar with the highway concept. If Los Angeles just adds a 10th lane to their highway, people just add more cars. The same thing happens on the energy markets as well. And so this is rarely considered in carbon projects, but it is a big problem for renewable energy credits. Direct air capture, I'm putting a stake in the ground right here, and I'll say leakage can occur when a system's electricity consumption reduces renewable energy availability that could have been used elsewhere. And one of my favorite examples is a California direct air carbon project. It's a giant CO2 fixation facility in Central California, and it uses a massive amount of green energy to do this, right? And it has a green energy plant devoted just to this facility. Less than 5 kilometers away is a natural gas power plant that is powering the city. And if the green energy from that direct air capture facility was used to power the city instead of the natural gas plant, without doubt, more carbon would have been removed from the atmosphere than this complicated approach of putting carbon into the atmosphere and then removing it 5 kilometers away with more electricity. This is not the case for all direct air capture facilities. So, obviously the ones taking place on the Icelandic volcanoes are not causing, energy displacement. If you're evaluating one of these projects, I wouldn't put in an evaluation this is a gigantic waste of human effort, but I would consider whether or not that energy, could have been better used on the local grid. What is the rate of renewables currently on the local grid, and where is the project sourcing its renewable energy from? Cook stoves. Like I said, it's been shown pretty clearly now that people who are given cook stoves will often just consume more. So they'll have 2 stoves going at once now, and one stove will be clean, and the other stove will be the old one. This is often ignored in carbon projects, or it's just considered to be a flat 5% without really any measurement. Okay, so let's talk next about quantification. So when I talk about quantification, I'm obviously talking about how much carbon is there. So in what projects do we have to be most worried about quantification? We should distinguish a couple of things here first. First of all, there is a difference between a stock and a flux. So a stock refers to how much carbon is being stored actively right now on the project. And a flux refers to how much the project is sucking in or out of the atmosphere. Certain types of carbon quantification is more difficult than others, and natural ecosystems are inherently more complicated than others. I will argue fervently that that doesn't mean that we should give up on them, but it just means that we need to put more effort into understanding them, and that the greater uncertainties need to come with greater uncertainty discounts. So projects that are more difficult to quantify are all the natural ones. Soil carbon, reforestation, mangroves, cook stoves are very difficult to quantify in some cases. We'll talk about some cases that being the case. Grassland management can be difficult to quantify too. Agricultural land management. In these cases, we're talking about trying to quantify soil carbon, which is difficult. Frankly, it's difficult to measure. So we are talking about just how much carbon is there. And one point I want to make is that the more simple the ecosystem is, the easier it is to measure. So, I mean, if we are talking about planting pine trees in rows, we may not like that from a biodiversity perspective, but it is easier to measure the carbon. No doubt about that. Temperate forests fall kind of in between. Tropical forests are pretty difficult. And then mangroves are notoriously the most difficult for anybody to measure. And you just need to look at the pictures to understand why that's the case. In terms of quantification, let me provide some tips here. The gold standard for quantification in natural systems are plot measurements. Now, these are tedious and expensive to take, but they are statistically most accurate. And even though you're not measuring like every single tree, you can derive a very statistically certain sample from a sampling of plot measurements. We have been doing this for over 100 years. And so, you know, if you're following a plot measurement guideline that like follows like U.S. Forest Service like protocols or something like that, there's no wiggle room there. Like, you're going to get the right measurement. But, you know, obviously if you're, you know, Vera just lets you create your own protocol. So that's terrible. But my point is that we've been doing this for so long that it is oftentimes kind of easier to spot when things are done properly. When you are considering plot measurements, you need to make sure that enough plots are taken. So Vera's protocols in particular require very few plots to be taken. All the other standards are quite good. So, you know, like ACR and Gold Standard have like rigorous plot inventory requirements. Vera allows you to take a scandalously low number of plots. So I once reviewed an improved forest management project that was about 30,000 hectares, and they measured 30-something plots. So it was like a little bit less than one plot per 1,000 hectares. That's an enormous size. And you know, if you look at like other programs, they would be required to take like probably 4 times as many plots as this project did if they were enrolled in like an ACR program. So that's something to look out for. People will use all kinds of spurious statistics to report their plot uncertainties as well. There is a very standard approach that absolutely everyone should be using, which is computing standard error from the variance observed in your plots, and then using that standard error and the plot number to calculate a confidence interval. You can reduce the number of plots needed if you do stratification ahead of time, but that is it. And people will, especially enrolled under the Vera protocols, will create their own statistical math to report lower uncertainties than there actually are. Okay, so that's all something to watch out for. Like I said, watch out for Vera. One of the things that I would point out is that the other thing you need to consider when taking field plots, or any type of plots, I would say, is allometry. What does allometry refer to? It refers to the conversion of the direct measurement that you're taking, be it tree size. I mean, presumably, maybe there's even allometry in like soil measurements at some point. But it refers to the jump between that raw measurement to how much carbon is stored in the tree. Allometric equations can be manipulated. You never want to see people use their own equations, because they should always be using peer-reviewed equations, ideally developed by a nation or by like a very prestigious lab group. In many countries, there is allometry. US, Canada, Mexico, the EU, allometric equations already exist for these trees. In other countries, it's trickier. One of the equations people often fall back to is the Chavez equations, which are not great, but at least kind of universally accepted. Point here is that the red flags that you're looking for when you're reviewing the allometry is, are they using their own allometric equation? There's never an excuse to do that. And are they kind of picking and choosing from a set of equations and kind of choosing the equation that gives them the most carbon? So, in parts of the Amazon, for example, maybe you'll find 5 papers that have written up allometric equations for trees. They'll pick the top of the 5, and they'll obviously get more credits for doing that. So that's what you should consider for allometry there. I can't speak too much to soil, although I have heard that the soil measurements are tricky as well. Let's talk about newer forms of quantification. The gold standard for quantification via remote sensing is LiDAR or drone data. Both are demonstrably as accurate as field inventories, if not more so. And, LiDAR and drone data allow you to really measure every tree. And these techniques can either allow you to count trees and see how big they are, or measure the height of trees directly. I won't say that every project that uses LiDAR or drone data has great measurements, because again, like any of these models, you can manipulate them, but it is a good sign. Space-based carbon stock estimates are becoming very common, but they have a lot of limitations. I think they are best in large RED+ projects where it's 50,000 hectares. You're never going to be able to measure the whole thing by LiDAR or by hand, and it just makes sense to use like a broader estimate. But at a small scale for like 1,000 hectare property, it's not going to be accurate enough. And the reason for that is that we don't have a way of measuring the tree's size or height directly from space. We have to use inferences that rely on things like the reflectance of the tree's greenness or like the structural backscatter of radar. The point is that the technology in space doesn't exist right now for small area carbon measurement particularly well. So for RED+ projects, I think it works. For reforestation projects or for measuring growth on like an IFM project or something, annual remeasurements of a subtle change, it is going to fall flat on its face. And one of the biggest reasons that spaceborne measurements are scary right now is that there are something like 6 different providers of this. Never mind a project developer who could just make their own maps. If you have someone shopping around between 6 different mapped estimates, and I've seen comparisons, these mapped estimates will vary by more than 100%. They're going to pick the one with the highest amount of carbon. So we have this inherent bias. If spaceborne measurements are being used in some capacity, again, I like to see it over RED+ projects. I don't mind seeing it used as a monitoring component. So they're best used as some sort of way of saying, like, has something bad happened to the trees? And they are also best used when used in conjunction with LiDAR or field inventories. So if you do have a field measurement over a site and you're then able to parameterize your space measurements from that and then make annual space measurements, you can get much more accurate results. So yeah, that's kind of when you want to see it being used. So it's very tricky to say like when people are doing it right or wrong, but I would say more towards the wrong side are small areas when you're trying to measure like incremental change like growth and you don't have any field inventories to like kind of correct the data. And more towards right are large areas or areas in which you have a monitoring component like annually to look at like losses, or areas in which you have like some higher quality data set feeding into that spaceborne estimate. So yeah, good luck. What about other types of systems? Soil carbon is notoriously difficult to measure. It's best done via plot sampling, and it's also best done by sending those samples away to a lab. That is often not realistic and easy to do. So you'll see a whole spectrum on the carbon markets of different types of soil sampling, with the absolute best being very costly, and then kind of the lower quality ones being more inference. Soil methodologies, can also measure other types of things in soil that can be beneficial too. different soil methodologies allow different levels of rigor. So, the Climate Action Reserve soil methodology, I would say, is more rigorous. Vera's soil methodology is one of the least rigorous. So they allow kind of the use of global averages, which is very risky. I'm sure that we're not right at all. Because, I mean, if you can imagine, just imagine like a regular like rolling crop field in like England or something. At different points on that hill, there's going to be very different amounts of soil carbon. Just based on the way that sediments flow and based on the soil depth at different points. So yeah, it's very hard for me to give like prescriptive advice for analyzing these projects. Just to say that like field measurements are best. You will find people using remote sensing on soil. That is not accurate at all. There is no remote sensing science that can measure like what's happening below the surface, with very, very few exceptions with like very experimental stuff. So just trying to measure like discoloration on the surface or like just like very subtle height differences on the surface is not a very good way of measuring soil quantity. So again, like field plots are the best thing that you can do. So I guess if you're trying to assess the soil quantification's quality of measurement, try to envision the spectrum of quality, with the highest being like soil plots that are sent off to a lab, and a middle being like soil plots with some like inference, and like the lowest end being global averages. For engineering and other projects, I mean, a lot of the time it's just a matter of a meter, and I can't speak much to those. For cook stoves, it varies by methodology. And one of the big scandals that occurred in cook stoves not too long ago is that a lot of Vera's cook stove projects were proven to be not doing much. Well, Gold Standard's projects didn't fall under the same scandal. And one of the reasons for that is that Gold Standard required that their cook stoves actually have a metered electricity measurement to say exactly how much energy is going into the cooking. So Vera didn't require that. Vera just used averages. I know this is rapidly becoming a Vera hate fest, but if you're talking about like quality measurements in carbon projects, then one can't help but notice Vera's methodologies aren't as good. So there was this big difference between like the Gold Standard cook stove projects that had physical meters on them and the Vera projects that were trying to use averages. And okay, so that's quantification to the best of my ability. Let's talk about permanence. So this obviously refers to how long will the carbon be stored, for how long should I consider my carbon credits to be worth anything, and what risks are there. So in terms of permanence, this is very important for a lot of different project types. Pretty much everything that you can imagine that's temporary, cook stoves, renewable energy, mangroves, nature-based agriculture, all have important permanence considerations. Sometimes I would say methane capture have permanence considerations. Those are handled pretty well by the methodologies. Methane doesn't last very long in the atmosphere. So removing it from the atmosphere has a big impact, but it's a bit short-lived. But although that is considered. Obviously, there are these types of carbon projects that have super, super long permanence. Wood burial, biochar, direct air capture, BECCS, biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, I think that's called. So I guess let's get into some of the considerations here. Most of the time when we're talking about permanence, we want to talk about the length of the contract. So, the contract says that you have to do something for some period of time, and once that expires, who knows what'll happen. Most of the time it's tied to like monitoring periods. There are exceptions when the carbon is stored kind of out of the way for long periods. We talked about those: wood burial, DAC, carbon capture and storage. I would say in terms of contract lengths, it varies by registry. And it gets quite complicated in terms of how we should be thinking about contract quality. So let's talk a little bit about that. Do I get into that? Yeah, generally speaking, when we think about permanence, we think longer contracts are better. That is not always the case. Longer contracts can result in permanence issues. So if you have a 100-year contract, you are probably killing your financial additionality, because it does not make financial sense anymore for you to be enrolling for carbon credits that sell for $28 a ton if you're then taking a forest that's going to be grown and cut 5 times during 100 years off the market. You're not compensating for the losses there. And so as a result, I mean, projects that tend to be 100 years tend to have really bad additionality. They're either being manipulated in some way by a timber company that intends to do this anyway, or they are, conserving land that's already conserved. So the California Air Resource Board has the 100-year contracts, and they have some really bad projects. That's been proven pretty concretely by a good paper by Berkeley, in which they showed that there wasn't any change in behavior in this program. Shorter contracts can also be bad or good, especially with reforestation and improved forest management. A short project length that is shorter than it takes to grow the trees out to merchantable size does nothing at all. So if it's going to take 40 years to grow the trees to size, you planted trees, it's going to take 40 years for them to get to timber size in which someone would want to cut them down. Or IFM, same thing. And you enroll it for 20 years. You've just paid someone to grow trees that they were already going to grow. You haven't actually paid them to grow trees longer than would normally be the case under normal common practice timber rotations. So ideally, if you have a 30-year-old forest that's going to be cut at year 40, a 20-year project makes a lot of sense. But if you have a 10-year-old forest that's going to get cut at year 40, a 20-year project makes no sense whatsoever. So in evaluating project length, you need to also consider rotation age of a forest. There are clever ways of dealing with project length that my projects and the Climate Action Reserve projects use, which is a method by which you discount shorter project terms and say, okay, if your project is only going to be 20 or 30 years, let's give you fewer credits. So, for under my project, if it's a 25-year project, you'd only get half the number of credits observed, and then you would be able to say something good has been done over the course of 50 years. The math does work out on this because of complicated arguments about atmospheric decay. Essentially, by keeping carbon out of the atmosphere for a period of time, you're still having a positive ripple impact on the future that can still be measured. So that's contract length. The key thing to keep in mind is, does it make sense in relation to what is typical practice for the region? And you always want a contract length that exceeds typical practice, I would say. Fire risk. Oh, well, let's talk about, the next type of risk is just kind of risk of damage. The next type of permanence is just kind of the risk of damage. So fire risk gets the most media attention in the carbon markets, but it is a very nuanced story that you need to consider when you're evaluating a carbon project. So first of all, many environments require fire, and fire is very healthy for a lot of forest types. One of the ways that they require fire is that, many species of trees only reproduce when a fire comes through. And so by suppressing fire in a carbon project, you are potentially causing trees to suffer and causing a forest to grow old and die and not reproduce. Another consideration is that although fire may decrease the amount of carbon, let's say a 20% decrease in a fire-resistant area, it often results in a flourishing of growth that will rapidly make up for that. So in a lot of ecosystems, post-fire recovery is the fastest period of growth, and it will actually suck a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere than if there was no fire at all. So that's another consideration. The intensity of fire really matters. So California's ecosystems are very resilient to fire, but the types of really intense fires that we've been observing recently, they are not resilient to. The other thing that I would consider is people often misidentify fire and lump in the fire risk with deforestation risk. In many parts of the world, clearing trees is associated with burning away the slash that you cleared. people will label that as a fire risk, even though the likelihood of that fire jumping to another area is extremely low, because they clear it away in kind of a standardized way, and the regions are not particularly susceptible to fire. This is another point that I want to make, I think, which is that in many forested ecosystems all over the world, they just don't burn. Like, when's the last time you heard of a gigantic fire in upstate New York, or in, like, Nova Scotia, Canada, or in, I don't know, Germany? Like, yeah, there are small fires that may occur in these places, but they are very easily controlled, and the ecosystems don't burn in a catastrophic way. So we tend to think of fire in terms of this, like, megalithic risk that affects all forested ecosystems, when in reality it's actually a minority of forested ecosystems that could be at risk. So let me talk about my next point, which is the Amazon rainforest. People will lump in deforestation risk as a fire risk because they look at fire models that have been created by people globally, and they say, oh, look, there's a huge fire risk because there's fires near the Amazon. Those are anthropogenic fires that are caused by people cutting down trees. They are not uncontrolled burns. Sometimes they are, and it depends on the part of the Amazon. But in a lot of the Amazon, you can't just throw a pin down on a map of, like, historical burn patterns or a map of fire risk and assume that that's, like, going to be the case. So it does get quite complex, and so here's another tip. Fires are extremely high risk in some ecosystems, and certainly in ecosystems that are more arid and are more susceptible to climate change-induced drought or climate change-induced temperature swings. There are some ecosystems on Earth that are probably not responsible, like it's not a good idea to enroll them for carbon. That includes a lot of the west coast of the United States, I would say. Like Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, California. If I see a carbon project in the Sierra Nevadas, I know that there's just a ticking time bomb there for that thing to catch fire. That includes, like, the west coast of Mexico too, like the Sierra Madres also. It includes a lot of areas. One of the things that project developers in high fire risk areas will do is they will throw a whole suite of kind of mitigating factors at you. We're building fire breaks. We've got a local fire brigade. We've got satellite monitoring every week. We've got roads that make firefighting really easy. That is great. And you do want to, like, make sure that projects have this if they're in a high fire risk area. But those mitigating factors, they do not solve fire risk. They take fire risk down from, like, 80% to, like, 75%. All of those factors in a California mega fire are not going to make that big a difference. So you do want to see those things, but I think that the storytelling exercise that developers will often tell people in, like, very high fire risk areas as a way of kind of mitigating their fire concerns, it's exaggerated. Okay, so I hope that was a nuanced take on fire. What is the solution here? Take every project as it comes. If there's a project in Michigan, don't even consider fire risk. Like, this is a waste of your time. If it's a project in California, think carefully about where in California, what tree species they're planting. Mitigation factors are important to consider. And then, at the end of the day, you're still stuck with a fire risk that you need to consider. Consider the length of the time of the project, and, it's still worth it to do conservation in these areas. So, try to use your best judgment. Using global maps is risky. What other types of natural risks do you need to consider? Obviously, you do need to consider the impact of climate change on the environment. Now, drought is something to really consider for certainly reforestation projects. Old trees are very good at surviving long droughts. Now, I will say, like, in parts of California and stuff, we are starting to see a decline in carbon stock due to droughts from older trees. But for the most part, that's a very slow decline. And for the most part, old trees are pretty resilient. But young trees for a reforestation project can be wiped out. That usually does not affect the project's carbon stock because, the trees are this big and they haven't been receiving credits yet. But it can certainly impact the project's finances. So this is definitely something to consider there. For other types of natural, for regenerative ag, for soil accumulation, grasslands and whatnot, you definitely want to consider the likelihood of prolonged drought, windstorms. You can work really hard to accumulate soil carbon on an ag site only for it to be swept away by a windstorm in a single year or a flood. And that's the other thing you want to consider is flood maps. In forested ecosystems, it's not that much of a concern. It is a big concern for young trees, and it's a big concern for these agricultural programs where the topsoil can just be flushed away and that carbon will just make its way back into the atmosphere after it gets broken down. Those are definitely considerations for those project types. And where to get the best information, you should be looking at topographic maps to determine the likelihood of flood. Some countries are very good. So the United States, Canada, they have some very good maps for flood risk. For wind risk, you will find climate models put out there. You should look at the historic likelihood of wind in the area. And drought and wind can pile on top of each other in an agricultural context. With forests, one of the other things that you want to consider is insects. So in systems that have not too many native trees, or one or two species of trees, insects can be a real risk. In more biodiverse ecosystems, you're probably okay, because an insect will come along and chew on a tree that represents 10% of the carbon. And this will definitely hurt the project a bit, but not it could recover from that pretty quickly. But if you're just planting one type of tree, or if the system itself is just an arid ecosystem and there's only one type of tree that grows there, this is definitely a risk. So things like mountain pine beetle, things like, there are some bugs that'll eat eucalyptus sometimes. Look at your species of trees and determine the likelihood of insect damage based on past outbreaks, I would say. Flood risk, we talked about. Sea level rise is something to consider for projects that are on the coast. Mangroves are pretty resilient against sea level rise in the long term because they're able to kind of accumulate soil as they grow and kind of outpace it to some extent. But young mangroves can be swept away in a storm, or the places that they're being planted are often in great amounts of flux. We've also seen projects that are not we've seen forests that are, probably being inundated by saltwater intrusion on the coasts that are also at risk in these areas. Wind throw could be wind damage. I don't think of wind throw as being a huge risk. Hurricanes can do damage, but most of the time they just nip out a couple of trees or damage the foliage. So it's usually not a massive reversal, but it's something to consider. They're only going to get worse. Okay, so I think that covers natural risk. All right. Next, I want to talk about growth modeling and forest management. So this is a component that's going to be very important if you're talking about a project that hasn't gotten started yet. One of the biggest things that we need to ask is, does the project have a well thought out forest management plan describing what the likely outcome and future objectives are for the forest? This is incredibly important for IFM and ARR projects. Now, with avoided deforestation projects, it's kind of hands off. Obviously, you're just letting the ecosystem regenerate. One of the big issues that we see sometimes with reforestation projects is this idea of planting and walking away. So we're going to put the trees in the ground, and then we're just never going to come back to the site. This is even baked into some methodologies that don't even allow you to do any thinning. This is really problematic from an ecological perspective. One of the first reasons it's problematic is that trees need babying for years. Vegetation will compete with them. They need either mechanical somebody to go out there with a weed whacker and kill back all the shrubbery that's trying to overtop them, or honestly herbicide. They may need other types of babying as well, like like little tree collars to make sure that like herbivores can't eat them. So that should be a part of the forest management plan of pretty much any reforestation project. There's rarely any instance in which you can plant trees and just successfully walk away. The other big issue is that thinning is a really important component to reforestation. And the reason for that is that we as ecologists often plant trees very densely together so that they grow up together and they outcompete all the other stuff around them. So if you plant trees densely together, they can fill in the gaps and nothing can compete with them. Like you can't have like a raspberry bush that comes in and competes with them. We are planting trees super densely early on. And when they get to the point where they all start like crowding each other out, that's very bad. It's bad for carbon. It's bad for the environment because you don't get a very biodiverse ecosystem. You don't get any light down into the understory that allows for more vegetation to spawn. So thinning is a normal practice for reforestation projects. In fact, in some places of the world, it is required. I mean, for a lot of tropical reforestation, it is impossible to reforest trees without some like two-stage approach. Another big reason for that is that a lot of the time the trees that we're trying to plant, Brazil nuts, sugar maples, they are evolved to grow in partial shade conditions. So if you plant them out in full sunlight in a tropical environment, they'll die. So what we will often do is plant some early stage, fast growing, little scrawny tree to provide some shade for the later trees. But those early trees will have to be removed if you want to regenerate a proper tropical ecosystem. So, when we don't see these things being accounted for in a forest management plan, or when we see just something that says like no harvesting is ever allowed, that is a bit of a red flag. We like to see very well thought out futures for these forests. And just to continue on ARR, because this is probably where it's most important, timber revenue is often quite important because, they're going to be sequestering carbon and earning carbon credits for a long time. But after a couple of decades, like, I don't know, 40, 50 years, they'll slow down in growth. And people will start eyeballing them. They're not getting paid anymore, right? Because the carbon program's over. And people are going to look at those trees and think, I could cut that down. It is really good if you build that into your project and you build in some sort of long-term timber revenue into the project so that there still is this incentive to keep the trees full grown and you're still providing them with this extra source of revenue. One of the things that Equitable Earth does that's really cool is they require a local ecologist to help write a forest management plan for all their projects. Yeah, I mean, again, that's very forest specific. I would say that certainly in regenerative ag, similar types of management plans are a pretty big requirement for a good carbon project to take place. Yeah. Now, what about storage in long-term wood products? This is something that is sometimes credited to forestry projects, with the rationale being that if you grow a tree that wasn't already going to be growing, and cut that tree down and then store that wood in a house, you're storing carbon for a long time. This is a good thing, and I think this is really important for making a lot of difficult projects financially viable. It's really good for IFM, where we're maybe pushing projects from pulpwood production into wood saw logs. But we do need to make sure that the calculations for long-term wood storage are conservative and based on like peer-reviewed science. And the highest standard that you can have, that some of the more picky buyers on the market have, is to have a solid tracking system to say, we cut these trees down, here they are at the mill, here they are, at going to their destination. Something akin to barcodes on timber. So that's what we really like to see. Most registries don't require that. Some projects go above and beyond to meet that. But we really don't like to see equations being used that are super old or assumptions being used that are not too conservative about how much wood is being stored. I will also point out, people have tried to receive carbon credits for long-term wood products for avoided deforestation projects. And I think this is very dangerous because on the one hand, you're paying people to conserve trees, but then you're also creating a financial incentive to harvest some of the native rainforest. And believe it or not, Verra's incredibly quality methodologies currently have a loophole that more or less allows you to claim carbon credits for the same tree. You can basically claim a carbon credit for preserving a tree and then cut that tree down and claim carbon credit for that too. So we have seen REDD+ projects like manipulating the system like that. I would be very leery of any avoided deforestation project that incorporated long-term wood product credits. That being said, sustainable harvesting is still a great thing in some of these projects. I would not be leery of a REDD+ project that had some sort of sustainable harvesting component, and I've seen some really good ones. What we often want to do is transition these ecosystems from like complete natural resource depletion to something that's kind of more sustainable. Now, what about forest growth modeling and forecasting? This is critical if you're trying to estimate how much carbon your project is going to sequester. The first question you have to ask is, are they using peer-reviewed models or did they pick their own models? I think it is extremely common in the carbon markets today for developers to create their own models. And we reviewed quite a few projects that had these kind of ex-ante forecasts. There was a very consistent positive bias. They were very often kind of saying that the trees were going to grow faster than they actually were. This is something that I think project developers almost have to do in order to secure funding to some extent. I kind of share some frustration here. Now, being wrong on this doesn't impact the quality of the project. Less trees will grow, less carbon credits will be issued. That's not a problem, but it will impact the quality of your investment if you're investing in a project. Here's an example. Some mangrove trees grow at very different rates. If you're planting mangroves in a very saline environment versus a freshwater environment, if you're planting mangroves in a desert versus a kind of tropical ecosystem, the same mangrove species can grow at more than 4 times different rates. And so we've seen instances of people like using mangrove allometry from much more desirable areas. And, those projects did not receive the number of credits they thought they would. But on the other hand, there are really well-accepted growth models that exist. And many countries have them. So United States and Canada, Mexico again. These are countries that have pretty robust forest inventories, and their governments or their forest agencies have created growth models that are impartial and a really good source of truth. So within the United States, people should pretty much always be using the Forest Vegetation Simulator. And you can certainly manipulate the outputs of that, but at the very least, it is kind of a peer-reviewed model developed by an agency. What about monitoring? At this point in time, monitoring should be done annually. There's really not much of an excuse to not have some sort of annual monitoring component to your nature-based project, regardless of the project type. Even regenerative ag can afford to, check out a satellite and make sure the field wasn't flooded or something like that. These things are easy to do, and anyone at this point can use Global Forest Watch data to get a pretty good estimate of how much losses took place. So, one of the big things we look for is the data sourced from an external reference. This is a good thing. We don't like project developers creating their own maps and then keeping those maps secret. Will the maps be shared publicly? This is a big red flag. Project developers that create their own maps and then don't release those maps, they often have something to hide because it's trivially easy to compare a project developer's deforestation map to a NASA's deforestation map. Falling back on Kariba, the Kariba project that we all love to hate, they created their own deforestation maps that said that there was 30 times more deforestation than the Hansen lab maps. So that was something that could have potentially been detected very, very easily early on if those maps had been public or if an auditor had done the comparison. Does the creator of the map have any financial bias, any history in underreporting deforestation? Sometimes people can pick and choose their maps, and this is problematic. I mean, again, we're at a place right now where there's maybe 6 different providers commercially of these maps. They have wildly different estimates because they're using relatively low quality, like satellite data, to make these estimates. And so people will pick the estimate that kind of favors them. And so it's always good to kind of compare a couple of these. I would say, always take Global Forest Watch. The Japanese Space Agency puts out a tree cover map. Google puts out a dynamic Earth, dynamic world, I think is what their map is called. The European Space Agency puts out a map. So there's 4 right there. And if your project developer is proposing some map that says there was this much deforestation, it should definitely lie within the range of those 4. Yeah, we want to know, does the project have a system in place for rapid detection of deforestation, for high-frequency alerts? Ideally, this is a system in place in which ground crews could actually respond to an issue in a timely manner. Certainly, there are alert systems that are public, that are out there, like the RAD alert system, which is put out by... I don't know who was put out. I don't remember. GLAD alerts are another one. They are, run every week and essentially get you a low quality but high frequency estimate of losses. And so if a REDD Plus project developer has something like this running every week and they have someone ready to jump in a truck, this is perfect. What's the timeline between loss and detection? It should not exceed a year. I mean, in this day and age, there is no reason that any nature-based project developer shouldn't be doing annual remeasurements. Even if they're not able to fully submit for carbon credits every year, because, Vera makes a very expensive and slow system, there should be some sort of annual monitoring. Here's an example of a number of REDD Plus projects that just haven't been monitored for a long time now. This one was last monitored in 2019. This one was last monitored in 2017. Clearly, they are not remeasuring these areas because they know that they were deforested. This project on the right here has been deploying their own monitoring system. They have a fairly robust system to detect fires and to detect losses. They make the outputs of those public. And so this is, everything that we like to see in a high-frequency alert system. Data management. Does the project have a methodology for storing data long-term? And the reason I have to ask this is that a number of instances have occurred where project developers have just lost the original data. 10, 15 years pass, they just don't, they're just not keeping the original Excel files around. It is important to have some sort of data management system that will last for 30 years, and that's a difficult thing in 2025. I think, it's great when these things are made public. It's great when these things, in this case with Open Forest Protocol, they're actually putting information on a blockchain that'll presumably be around for as long as I think like the Ethereum blockchain is, probably 30 years. But there are instances of essentially ghost projects in which every scrap of data has been lost, or every important scrap. So here's an example of a project that lost the original data to a 15-year-old project. This project actually changed registries. So when it switched from one registry to another, all of the kind of vital data was lost, or at least it didn't come over. Now it's on gold standard. It was originally an ARR project under the Clean Development Mechanism. The project was sold to another firm, who just kind of sits there and passively collects money for this plantation, and it's not clear at all who owns this thing. It is not clear what their carbon measurements are, what they were in the beginning, what their forest management plan was. There is literally nothing out there about this project, but someone is still earning 20,000 credits a year. I guess this slide's in here just to point out that much of this stuff that I'm describing is best tackled through some sort of quantitative process. So we would try to come up with quantitative numbers for most of these things. we would run our own dynamic baselines. We would run our own leakage estimates with economics modeling. We would measure the carbon with our own remote sensing models. If you're capable of doing that type of diligence, that's kind of the best way to go, I would say, rather than judging it based on the methodology. Because, any skilled scientist or technical person can usually write up a very eloquent methodology, even if they're cheating like you wouldn't believe. What about co-benefits? Well, one of the first types of co-benefits that you have to consider are ecological co-benefits. So, what other impacts could the carbon project have? That includes things like wildlife. I would say it even includes things like benefits that could benefit people through ecological means. So water filtration is one example. Bringing back species that are really important food supplies for the local people. We encountered a mangrove project not too long ago that after they had successfully restored their mangroves, fish catches in the local villages started going up because obviously the fish reproduced in the mangroves, and that was very beneficial to the local villages' economies. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly instances of bad ecological benefits. A number of these Red Plus projects allow big game hunting to take place inside of them. I don't think that that's personally a great thing. I mean, people will make the case that it's done sustainably. I don't think it's a good look for a carbon credit or a program. And I'm not convinced that it is done sustainably in a lot of these places. So be on the lookout for that. It's not as if they'll advertise that. You have to basically go and see if you can book a lodge to kill an elephant in a nearby village. Honestly, that's how we would figure that stuff out. In terms of community benefits, there's a lot to unpack here. Yeah. Okay. So one of the most important things is, what is the revenue sharing breakdown? You need to understand where the money is going here. What percentage of the revenue goes to communities? I have always been of the opinion that it should be 60% or more, and that, the other 40% is, certainly some of it can be profit, but a lot of it is going to be operations and stuff. Plan Vivo and isometric are the only two methodologies that have percent sharing requirements. Many carbon projects, as I'm sure you're all aware, don't state how much revenue they share with communities. And when it's been investigated by reporters, it's been found that in excess of 90 to 95% of the project's revenue has been pocketed by people in the global north, project developers. So, and it's quite common in these. I guess one of the big traps that you'll find in project documentation is that they will wax poetic about how beautiful their benefits are. You've taught people how to garden. You've given them beekeeping lessons. You've given them job training. They can pull themselves out by their bootstraps. You are taking a natural resource away from somebody, and you need to compensate them for what they could have done with that natural resource, be it timber or be it agriculture. And if you're not doing that, you are participating in colonialism. So we need to be very careful here about making sure revenue sharing is fair. And any project developer who you're working with should be forced to describe what the revenue share is if there's any sort of community component. Now, obviously, if this is an improved forest management project on with a giant timber company, who really cares? But anytime there's a community component of any type of project, this needs to be very clear. And again, okay, I think I get into some of these. So Renoster would break out benefits into, broadly speaking, 3 categories. So the highest level of benefits that we would describe for projects are direct payments. Numerous studies have shown that you get better outcomes by letting people spend their own money. Payments should go to individuals, ideally. If not that, community councils that are democratically elected and include minority groups. And there should be clear tracking of those payments. So we love to see massive Excel spreadsheets to see who everybody got paid. I would say in lieu of direct payments, tangible infrastructure is kind of the second tier of co-benefits. Infrastructure with a real dollar value. Building X number of schools for this much money. Hospitals, water treatment plants, roads. Not just roads, you need to access the site. Money can be put aside for scholarships. Money can be put aside in I don't know, like trust fund type deals that can support the communities. Hiring teachers and healthcare workers, material goods of value, buying people computers, installing internet, buying people equipment. These are all tangible investments into the community that we can tie our dollar value to and say 60% of the revenue went to blank. What does not count as good co-benefits? Those I would describe as soft and impermanent. So jobs. We do not consider jobs to be a co-benefit that should be really claimed in carbon projects. Why is that? Because a lot of the time, if they were using the land for something else, more jobs would have been created. You know, if you're using the land for agriculture, odds are you would have employed more people. So the fact that your carbon project employs 30 for 20,000 hectare area instead of 300 people to work the farm is nothing to brag about. Job training. We find this quite insulting. You know, you've taken a natural resource from people. You should be paying them to make up for the fact that they can no longer earn income off their land. Just training them to get a job somewhere else is not sufficient. It is not a co-benefit. You should give people monetary resources to educate, like to achieve education and jobs. But that does not involve like you putting on a course on how to keep bees or shift to some other like niche. Community courses and seminars, beekeeping, community gardening are rank on the bottom of the list. But I mean, it's quite common for community courses on other things to be pretty worthless. These are impermanent benefits. This is a 30-year project or 40. You are stopping somebody from using their land for 30 or 40 years. A one-time beekeeping course is not going to cut it. Non-monetary promises, anything that doesn't have a dollar value attached to it should be viewed with extreme skepticism. There are just countless carbon projects that claimed that they were going to do this, and this in their project description document. The credits didn't sell for as much money as they said they would, whatever it is, and those things didn't materialize. And then infrastructure that's associated with the project. If you need to construct a road to get to your project site, you shouldn't be claiming that as a co-benefit. That's just part of the program. So certainly that's not, it's not additional in a very real sense. What about justice? Free, prior, and informed consent is an issue that is not it for all intents and purposes does not exist in the carbon markets right now. Why do I mean that? There is no carbon registry that really requires informed consent. Not in the sense that any research study or any sociologist would require. Informed consent means that people know exactly what they're signing up for. They know what the revenue share is. They know how much the carbon credits are going to sell for. They know they have done the financial analyses to figure out what the trade-off is between enrolling for carbon versus whatever the alternative scenario is. And informed is the part of free, prior, informed consent that is missing from the carbon markets. Even to this day, I'm recording this on December 21st, 2025. There was just a scandal that came out about a REDD Plus project in Brazil where project developers were strong-arming people into signing contracts. There are innumerable projects that have failed to obtain free, prior, informed consent. This has resulted in countless lawsuits. It has resulted in countless scandals. We all know of carbon cowboys, but this happens pretty regularly with all the large carbon companies, I would say. Look, again, if you're talking about like enrolling a gigantic timber company into a carbon program, who cares? Like, obviously it's on them to do the diligence. They're $1 billion company. But anytime that there's small landowners involved, this needs to be supervised, or it needs to be very clear what's happened here. One of the programs that I like is the Climate Action Reserve's Mexican Protocol, in which everyone that lives in an ejido has to like really clearly sign an FPIC document, and there's usually some sort of video of that happening and a video of them describing the project to these people, which really makes it clear everything that they told the people. That said, like the car projects are also not perfect on FPIC because they are working on community land for ejidos, for native communities, and oftentimes people live in that land who don't actually belong to the ejido and aren't able to give consent for a project that's taking place right in their backyard. Grievance mechanisms are incredibly important. Do they allow for third-party grievance? The answer to this is almost universally no. Now, there are newer registries like Equitable Earth and Isometric have direct mechanisms by which people inside projects can file a grievance. But older registries, and particularly Vera, have no independent grievance mechanism that we really would consider such. Vera pretty much makes people go through the project developer to file a grievance. And there have been multiple scandals resulting from this. Like I said, there was a guy in Cambodia who got locked up. One of the more famous examples was multiple sexual abuse cases over the course of more than 10 years inside of a very large Vera carbon project. The project developer's employees were abusing people and abusing them in a bunch of ways. One way they were doing so was withholding project funds, like withholding community benefits from people unless they had sex with them. This never made it out until reporters reported on it because there wasn't a grievance mechanism. You would just file a grievance to the person who's sexually abusing you. This is still the case. Like, I don't know about like the sexual abuse in this project, although I know the project still operates. But it's certainly still the case that Vera projects don't have a particularly high standard for grievances. So, if you're reviewing a Vera project, try to make sure that the project developer is going above and beyond and like has some sort of third party or independent mechanism that is very easy for people to submit grievances for. Like I said, ERS has a very strong grievance mechanism that anybody can fill out. Here's the last thing. We need to keep balance in mind when reviewing carbon projects, because there are a lot of people putting huge amounts of diligence into carbon projects right now, but balance the size and the scope of the project against A, the amount of diligence you need to put into it, and B, the level of rigor you expect from people. Because if you're talking about a small landowner, like here's one guy whose property was 1,700 acres in the U.S., like 500 hectares. He developed it himself, created his own little carbon project. He doesn't need like an extreme level of rigor in like budgets and grievance mechanisms and whatnot, right? Like it's 500 hectares that belongs to one guy. Timber companies have a lot to contribute here. And I think that the point that I wanted to make here is that, timber companies, they often get a lot of flack from myself and others. And some of their projects are not particularly additional. But we do kind of sometimes avoid some of the difficult grievance issues that exist in other program types. So what projects deserve the most scrutiny? Those in the global south, obviously those in which like there are people who are at some sort of disadvantage. So if you've got $1 billion project developer who can hire a gaggle of lawyers versus like an impoverished rural community in Paraguay, that's a legal imbalance that you have to be very wary of. Projects on community land, projects with a lot of small landowners, you need to be worried about. Projects that are super big. When you have these gigantic REDD+ projects, and this definitely includes Article 6, you increase the likelihood of some sort of strife or some sort of disagreements or things going awry. The further you get away from individual stakeholdership, from this one guy in California who loves his land, the harder your project's going to be. Because if you're working with a project that's got 200,000 people living inside of it or more, none of those people care. None of those people are really invested in making the thing work. Whereas if you are working with somebody in their backyard, they care a lot. And then, look at historical injustices. Look at the nation of Cambodia and how they treat people. That kind of thing. Okay, so that covers the how to do these reviews. I know that everything here is qualitative. I think that where you can be quantitative, you should try to be. Otherwise, do your best to make a rubric. We obviously made a rubric and separated the quantitative aspects where we could directly measure their baseline against ours, and the qualitative aspects where it was bad, moderate, good. And once if you have something like a rubric that covers these points, you can then start comparing projects to each other and figure out which ones rise to the top. Yeah, best of luck out there.